Hi. With this talk, I'd like to share a few thoughts about utilization of ground motions in engineering practice, and also talk about a recent project I undertook to select some CyberShake ground motions for engineering use. I'm also presenting this on behalf of a number of collaborators who helped with these projects who are listed here below at the bottom of the slide. This work is supported as well by U.S. Geological Survey and Southern California Earthquake Center. So to start, I'd like to use this cartoon illustration often to talk about this context. So when we're using simulations for engineering practice, there's really two stages of engineering analysis where they can be used. Right, we start from a model for seismic sources in the region, and we use ground motion prediction to perform seismic hazard analysis and ultimately get to a response spectrum or response spectra targets that we would use. And in that hazard analysis stage, traditionally the prediction of ground motion amplitudes has been done using empirical models, but increasingly ground motion simulations are utilized at that step in order to simulate ground motions and then assess through those simulations what ground motion amplitudes could be expected from a particular seismic source. Then the engineering analysis continues using that target response spectrum. If we're doing an engineering analysis that involves response history analysis, dynamic analysis of a structure, we'll select a set of ground motions that is consistent with that target response spectrum and use those ground motions as input to a dynamic analysis of structural performance. I think this diagram for me clarifies a couple things. So one is that the ground motion simulations could be used at either stage, right? They could be used for the ground motion prediction or in the response history analysis where the simulations are the sources of these ground motion time series. And the issues involved with utilizing the ground motions for engineering analysis are different in those two cases. On the bottom left, for the hazard analysis, we're going to need very large numbers of simulations, potentially, in order to assess ground motion amplitudes from a range of seismic sources. And it's really the amplitude of shaking measured via response spectra or some other metric. That amplitude is really the important part of the ground motion time series when it's simulated. On the bottom right portion, at the response history analysis stage, the average amplitudes of those ground motions is actually not particularly important because we're specifying the amplitude before we start doing any of the analysis through that target response spectrum. So the amplitudes of the ground motions are fixed, and all we're doing is trying to find time series that are consistent with those amplitudes and consistent with other features of the ground motions of interest. And it's really the time series characteristics and phasing and things like that that's important for our engineering analysis in terms of getting an informative result for our structural performance. We also need many fewer ground motion time series in the bottom right figure, kind of illustrated by the smaller number of time series in the graphic. So I find that useful to keep in mind. With that in mind, I've talked in a previous paper, I'll provide the citation in a moment, about a variety of approaches for ground motion simulation validation. So when we talk about validation, there's a lot of different things that could be done. What we call the historical approach is to take a past earthquake that has recordings and then produce simulations for that same earthquake. So here's a kind of an old graphic from the Loma Prieta earthquake, the map showing the surface projection of the rupture and the triangles showing locations of recording stations that actually recorded the earthquake. And then various simulation algorithms can be used to simulate the Loma Prieta earthquake, and we get a simulation that can be compared to the recording. A couple things can be done. The waveforms themselves can be compared, so that's the kind of the illustration in the middle of the slide here, the kind of wiggle by wiggle comparison of the time series. That's interesting and particularly useful for kind of diagnosing any issues or refinements with the simulation algorithm. The amplitudes of the simulations and recordings can also be compared. That's kind of illustrated by this plot down in the bottom center of the slide. So that's a pretty straightforward strategy. We definitely have kind of a ground truth that can be compared to, and it's easy to conceptualize what's going on. The challenge is we're limited only to the earthquakes where we have past observations, and so that restricts somewhat the range of comparisons that we can make. Another strategy is what we call the empirical model approach. So here we can use a kind of a generic earthquake scenario. For example, this graphics is from like a magnitude 7 earthquake on a strike slip fault, and just say, well, we're going to specify a rupture of that type and generate simulations. And then we don't have a historic observation of this generic earthquake, but we have empirical ground motion prediction models. And so we could look at what does an empirical model predict for response spectral amplitudes from this generic scenario, and what are the amplitudes typically seen in the simulations. And so those types of comparisons can be made. Those are both popular strategies for ground motion simulation validation that have been used extensively. And we're just kind of trying to put some names and structure to this. Both of these really focus on applications of simulations for hazard analysis. They're focused primarily on the amplitudes of the ground motions that are getting produced by the simulations, and are those amplitudes realistic as compared to historical data or to empirical models, right? And if there's discrepancies, what might be the source of those discrepancies? Final strategy I'll talk about here today is what we call the similar spectra approach. So here what we do is we specify the response spectra, and you could generalize this to other metrics of ground motion intensity. We're going to specify that spectra, and then we're going to find simulations and recordings that have equivalent response spectra and use those to predict other things like response of a structure. So here, the cartoon at the bottom shows kind of in black and blue, the response spectra of some recordings. And if those are equivalent, and we use those ground motions as input to a structural model, then we can look at the responses of that structure and see, did the simulations and recordings produce different answers in terms of structural response? And if so, what might be the source of those differences? So this is a validation approach that's really focused on the right half of my initial graphic. We've specified the response spectra, and we want to know, what are the implications in terms of structural demands, whether I use recordings or simulations. And if the simulations produce different answers than the recordings, is that because there's some additional features of interest that are not captured in the recordings, or is it because there's something unphysical about the simulations that might be producing artifacts in the structural responses? And so that's an investigation that we can then perform. Okay, so that's kind of first message, is just those three approaches for simulation validation. They each have kind of advantages and disadvantages. And importantly, the first two versus the third are really aimed at different aspects of the engineering use of the simulations. And so doing an empirical model comparison of the amplitudes of ground motions produced by simulations doesn't really give me much information about whether those same simulations would be suitable for response history analysis. Okay, one final note about these simulation approaches. We thought the concept of proxy ground motion metrics was really helpful in this domain. So a proxy metric is a simple ground motion parameter, and the results from this metric can be compared between simulations versus recordings or empirical predictive models through these historical or empirical comparison techniques that I just talked about. And ideally, this metric is simple but relevant for engineering analysis. And so things like elastic response spectra are the most common, or the most commonly evaluated right now. There's other things we can look at, like polarization of ground motions in multiple directions, or inelastic response spectra, or correlations of metrics between different intensity measures. Another important characteristic is that these proxy metrics should be relatively stable in the sense that we know what the correct answer is. And by stable, I mean that the behavior of this metric is relatively well understood. It's either not varying across rupture events strongly, or it's varying across rupture events in some way that we understand physically, or have good constraints on it empirically. And ideally, if there's multiple empirical models for this metric, they're all in pretty good agreement. So what we want to have is a sense that we know the right answer from observational data, and then when we look at simulations, we can evaluate whether they're consistent with that answer that we expect. And ideally, if these metrics are somewhat simple and there's a discrepancy in these metrics and simulations, it's hopefully easy to kind of reverse engineer and try to figure out what that source of that discrepancy might be in the simulation, so that they can be further refined to reflect some characteristic that's important to us. So a few examples listed at the bottom, and then finally I'll note at the bottom this citation to a paper from a few years ago that kind of talks about this concept and some of the validation strategies in a little more detail. Okay, so I'm going to change directions here for the last few minutes of the presentation and talk, one more slide. With this validation in mind, I worked with Brendan Bradley and a couple colleagues a few years ago on the paper noted at the bottom of the slide here. And we proposed, just for the sake of trying to structure these ideas, this matrix for evaluating validation. So across the top of the plot, we have a range of metrics that could be used for validation. So starting from the left, kind of the most straightforward but the least kind of general validation would be to look at the waveforms between simulations and recordings and make qualitative observations. Let me explain these axes, and then I'll talk about the results. Then moving over, we have kind of elastic response spectra. We can move to additional IMs, intensity measures like duration and inelastic response spectra. So these middle columns are really those proxy metrics, simple engineering metrics that we think are informative of kind of demands on structures ultimately. And then all the way to the right, we have a full multi-degree of freedom response of a complex system, like a full structural model. And we can use all of those things to try to compare. The far right would be these similar spectra types of validations. And then down the left side, we have kind of the context in which the validation was performed. So was it performed for just a generic conditions, like a layered half space with a particular site profile? Was it performed for a specific geographic region or specific source to site azimuths? So that's bringing in kind of 3D crustal velocity structure and the effect of things like sedimentary basins in a particular region. And then we can go all the way to site specific. And so here now we've got kind of the characteristics of our particular site, their characteristics of kind of the sources and the wave propagation paths from those sources to the site. So that would be kind of the most refined situation, and that's where the simulations have the potential to capture the effects of particular wave paths that the empirical ground motion models wouldn't capture. Okay, so inside of this plot, we made the supposition that qualitative waveform validation alone is not sufficient for these for utilization in practice. There are situations where waveforms can look good, particularly in certain frequency ranges, but there might be other problems with the simulations that wouldn't be apparent from that type of comparison. I said if we move to kind of these more complex metrics of proxy metrics or complex system response, then we get in the domain where that's we've got enough information to think about engineering analysis. If this validation is just done in a generic region, we think we're getting now time series that are suitable for response history analysis, and the thinking there is that our ground motion recordings are effectively coming from a generic region because we're typically using recordings from one location and applying them to be used in some other location. And so that would be similar to using simulations that have been validated in kind of generic conditions. When we get down to the kind of specific location type of validation in the bottom right of this plot, now we think if those validations have been performed, we've got simulations that are suitable for seismic hazard analysis as well, and should be potentially superior to empirical models for seismic hazard analysis because they have the ability to accurately reflect the impacts of site-specific conditions. So I think that's kind of one way to think about it. This isn't a kind of a consensus document from a larger society, but I think that's a rational way of kind of thinking about these problems and trying to sort out what types of analysis would be suitable to justify use of ground motion simulations. Okay, so now I want to switch gears and talk about a second related effort, which is a recent effort we undertook to select CyberShake ground motion time series for engineering analysis. This is engineering analysis response history analysis. The citation is down at the bottom of the slide here. This is a paper that's in Press and Earthquake Spectra documenting this more completely, but I'll give you a few minutes overview of what we did. So we took the perspective of an engineering consultant using response history analysis. So kind of going back to my first figure, that consultant's going to have a site-specific target spectrum, probably developed using empirical ground motion models, but increasingly could be informed by ground motion simulations. But they have the target spectrum, and they need time series to perform response history analysis. We further thought about kind of tall building analysis as a good target in that response history analysis is performed frequently for those types of buildings, and the long period features from sedimentary basins and things like that would be important in influencing the tall building analysis. So simulations could really offer a lot of insight in those cases. And say the engineering consultant we kind of had in mind is used to accessing things like the peer ground motion databases that has a relatively simple graphical user interface. And they're going to have a short project timeline and limited budget to do kind of research type things. So they need to quickly get at their time series. And finally, we assume that this consultant believes that CyberShake ground motions could be suitable for their analysis. And so this is a large project to perform ground motion simulations. I won't describe it here. I think you've got descriptions in other contexts of that CyberShake project. So we'll say they have some belief that those simulations would be appropriate, but they'd like some kind of vetting and pre-screening of the full suite of motions. So the raw database has a couple challenges, that the interfaces require some sophistication in order to access the time series, so SQL queries and things like that. And there's also hundreds of millions of time series, and so to expect a consultant without a lot of experience in that to be able to screen through that very large amount of data to get to their time series and then take this in front of a peer review committee and justify what they've done, that's a large challenge for a lot of these consultants. So with that kind of context in mind, we went ahead and selected a smaller set of ground motions and tried to kind of address these issues. So the idea was to kind of look at several locations and site conditions in the CyberShake study area. We don't have kind of pre-knowledge of where exactly this project might take place that we're envisioning. We'll look at kind of a range of ruptures of interest, try to identify those, identify the expected shaking that would be caused by those ruptures, and then search the database for compatible ground motions, do some review of the results, and produce some documentation of the selected ground motions. So let me tell you a little bit more detail about that. So we considered the CyberShake study area, which is near Los Angeles. So here's a kind of a map of the study region, the rectangle showing where the simulations were produced. I'll mention these are the most recent available broadband CyberShake ground motions that have kind of a high frequency stochastic component as well as a low frequency deterministic simulation. The triangles in this map show the locations that we considered, so that's kind of the populated areas of the Los Angeles region. We worked with the USGS colleagues mentioned at the start of the presentation, and they performed disaggregation for all of those locations. We looked at MCE amplitudes, and we looked at 4 periods from kind of short periods to long periods, trying to say, these MCE amplitudes that the engineering analysis we performed at, and then a range of periods, what are the sources that are really dominating the hazard? And we, per fault source in the region, we got a mean, magnitude, and distance. The table here shows kind of the results for one particular site in one particular period. So we get kind of a range of sources, contributions from each, and then a mean, magnitude, and distance associated with each source. So we did this for all the sites, all the locations, also for 2 site conditions, and kind of here's what we get for all of those magnitudes and distances like in that table. So most of these sites are the hazard is dominated by kind of nearby faults, 0 to 10 or 20 kilometers, and large magnitude earthquakes, 6.5 and up. And then there is kind of this portion a little bit up higher and to the right of San Andreas faults, that sources that are a little more distant to a lot of these study sites, but still produce strong shaking due to large magnitudes of those ruptures. For comparison, in green, this is the magnitudes and distances of the recordings in the NGA West 2 database from Peer. So that's kind of the de facto database that would be used for projects in the Los Angeles area. A very large, rich database, but relatively sparse in these kind of large magnitude, small distance ruptures that are of interest, as we determined from the hazard analysis. And so that's always the challenge with the ground motion selection. So what we did, this is the same axes, but just zoomed in. So we're zoomed into kind of the largest magnitudes and the smallest distances. The points still show the disaggregation results, and then the thin black lines show kind of contours of probability just to see where the most likely cases are, kind of adding back in that percent contribution. What we did is we wanted to focus on kind of the largest magnitude, smallest distance scenarios, because those aren't well represented in the catalog. There are contributions from magnitude 6 earthquakes at 10 kilometers, but we can find recordings of those types, so I don't think the simulations have as much claim on advantages there. So what we did is we picked these 4 scenarios shown by the black dots to kind of represent scenarios that were commonly arising in the disaggregations, and then tried to go find time series from those. If we just kind of plow ahead and try to go search the database for time series matching these, we'll find that in some of these cases there's actually millions of time series available, because there are so many ruptures in the CyberShake simulations that are consistent with those characteristics. So we need to further narrow things down and also kind of ensure that the response spectra of the selected ground motions were appropriate. So the approach we used, we call it a similar spectra search. So for each target, magnitude and distance, and we also had a site condition, which we varied a bit. For those conditions and inferred rupture mechanisms and things like that, we went and computed kind of means and standard deviations and correlations of response spectra that we would expect, and we computed those from empirical ground motion models. So here's the idea is that for one of these cases, the mean response spectrum is shown in solid black, the plus or minus 2 standard deviations is shown in dashed lines, And then in green, it shows kind of Monte Carlo simulations of response spectra that we expect given these characteristics. So just a computer simulation of response spectra. And then this blue spectrum is just one of those as an example. So let's just take one of those spectra out. So that's a response spectra that we could anticipate from a earthquake with the given rupture characteristics. So we then took that response spectrum to the CyberShake catalog, which is shown over in the right figure. So the blue spectrum stays the same. The light blue spectra are the candidate spectra from the CyberShake database. This is just 100 or so for illustration, but in principle, there could be millions available. And then we go search through the catalog and go find a ground motion with a comparable spectra. So that's the black response spectra in this figure. And so we repeat that process for all the different rupture scenarios and generate kind of a population of ground motions for each rupture scenario. So a couple notes at the bottom, we selected kind of 2 component ground motions. That's what would be needed for an engineering analysis. For each of these target scenarios, we selected 40 pairs of ground motions. There were 4 magnitude distance scenarios and 2 site conditions. So 8 total scenarios. That gave us 320 ground motion pairs. And we felt that a few hundred ground motions was enough to give a user some flexibility, but not overwhelm them with a huge amount of data. So we end up with ground motions from this process that are strong because we're looking at these kind of nearby large ruptures, but they're not outliers compared to recorded ground motion libraries. So here, I've got a couple comparisons of the selected ground motions versus the NGA-WES2 database again. So on the left is, I think, about 100 samples from each database. In green is shown the NGA-WES2, so this is response spectra on the left. And in black is shown some of these CyberShake ground motions that were selected. And so you can see the black ones are strong, but they're not sitting above the NGA-WES2 database motions by any stretch. On the right, this is another way to look at it. This is 0.1 second response spectra on the horizontal axis and 5 second response spectra on the vertical axis. This is now the entire set of databases. So, and this is plotted in log scale. So the black dots, this is the 320. So you see they're up in the kind of upper right corner of the NGA-WES2 database, corresponding to the large ruptures or large ground motions that are in that database. They maybe edge a little bit larger than the NGA-WES2 database, but not excessively so. And also you note that they kind of maintain the correlations between these metrics realistically, because that was managed in the sampling of targets. We went through, produced a range of documentation. So there's plots, PDFs of time series and response spectra. There's a flat file of all of the ground motion intensity measures, as well as the rupture characteristics. That's all been put in a permanent repository on Zenodo. So here's a screenshot of that repository, as well as a URL at the bottom if you want to go look at that. And it's intended to be there forever and kind of for everything to be available for interested users. We also implemented it in an open source ground motion selection software that I've maintained for a few years. Some of you might have utilized. So that's available at the URL noted at the top. And it's a set of MATLAB scripts where you can specify either a rupture or a target spectrum and then search ground motion databases to go find appropriate ground motions. And you can do conditional spectrum. You can tightly match a target spectrum, kind of as illustrated by the figures on the right. It's set up to be keyed to kind of popular recorded ground motion databases, but we've loaded in this CyberShake database as well. So it's also easy to specify a target and search for recorded or simulated ground motions with very minimal changes to the software. So hopefully that's another tool that allows people to easily access this data. It's all available freely there. Okay, to conclude the presentation, a couple messages. So I think there's several ways in which simulations can be used and validated. And how you go about validating the ground motions depends on how they're going to be used. And I think importantly, separating the hazard analysis validation from the time series response history analysis validation is a useful concept. Another useful concept, I think, is this proxy metrics, just to say, what are some simple metrics that I could evaluate that would be informative of the more sophisticated analysis I intend to do? If we can do these validation on generic proxy metrics, that can build some confidence around using these simulations for engineering analysis. And I didn't say it, but the CyberShake is one platform that's really been extensively evaluated in a lot of ways through proxy metrics. And so we've started building confidence there of the usefulness of those simulations. And then finally, I described this recent project to select a set of simulated ground motion time series. And it's intended to support kind of engineering projects using response history analysis, as well as facilitate research. And I think, in particular, the ability from the last tool I mentioned to search recordings and simulations equivalently. You can get paired sets of ground motions to do research studies, kind of comparing other aspects of these simulations and recordings. I hope we'll facilitate those types of things so that we can advance the state of practice with these resources, as well as further advance our research with additional studies. Finally, I'll note at the bottom there's a URL for my website. So that website has links to the ground motion data that I mentioned. It's got all of the papers that I cited available. If there's anything that piqued your interest here, head over there, and there's lots of additional resources that I hope you'd find useful in your work or your studies in this area. So thanks very much for your time. With that, I'll close.